why it needs to be done, what it is that is going to look at why organisations need to account for carbon, but actually how you go about doing that, and essentially what that data gives you, and therefore how you can then use that data to make improvements. So I'm going to hand you over to Jay, who's going to be recording.
I've got my cameraman.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Say cheerio to Stuart, and I'll back up.
Right, good afternoon. This session is being recorded, so you can shout or ask as many questions as possible. It's part of a unit which we call the PGCHE. So if you want to become lecturers tomorrow, that is the course you need to enter. And usually those who are masters or doctoral level, on their final year, they will take a PGCHE. The PGCHE is virtually a mandatory course now for all lecturers in the UK to have. So previously, if you have a PhD, you can just teach, but not anymore. Things have changed. And being on the course for over 12 months, all I can tell you is that it's not as easy as you think it is. It's more psychology. How students learn, what are the conditions for students to learn, what gives them the facility to pick up things, deep learning, surface learning. These kind of matters is taught on the course, and then we're moving on. Okay, so that's the reason. So it's recorded because it's going to be presented to other universities. Part of my CV. Today's CV is getting more competitive. Rather than just have a few lines and words that you have thought, I'm adding that one extra mile where include a video. They see what you can do, how you present yourself, rather than into a lengthy interview process. Okay, so today Richard is my supervisor on my doctoral thesis. Luckily, I have submitted it today, in fact, to the graduate office, and gradually the machinery will take on the final external examiner, internal examiner, and then you have to do a defense, both internally and externally, before you get your thesis. So the topic which I've chosen in my doctoral thesis is quite related to this particular presentation, which Richard told me that could be beneficial, not for a learning point of view, but for a global picture on sustainability. We've heard a lot about carbon footprinting. Everybody is doing carbon footprint, but what exactly it is and how do we manage it? So I've decided to give you a simplified version of carbon footprint accountability and reporting. Has anybody thought about carbon footprinting? Know the mechanisms? Or it's just a word at the present time that sticks out? Do we have anybody actually accounting for carbon in the UK? Whether you go to the supermarket, you buy a bunch of grapes, they're grown in California, they're air freighted all the way to the UK, and that spews a lot of carbon, for which nobody is accounting for it. Of course, all this relates to climate change. Today in the boardrooms of major corporations, it's carbon emissions and climate change, which is the major topic actually being thought. So, let me give you a short video. I'm able to do this pretty well, so let's see how we come up with this.
At the simplest level, a carbon footprint is a measure of the size of climate change impacts created by greenhouse gases from human activities. The term references carbon dioxide, which is the most plentiful greenhouse gas. Although it is the most common, carbon dioxide is only one of 6 gases that drive climate change, as identified by the IPCC. On a molecule-by-molecule basis, these 5 other gases actually play a stronger role in forcing climate change, but we'll talk more about that later. Our planet has a natural capacity to breathe in and store carbon, primarily in forests and oceans. Our use of resources, like drilling for oil and burning gasoline, exhales that carbon back into the atmosphere. It may take decades to put it back into storage. The term carbon footprint actually stems from an earlier idea called ecological footprint. The idea is that environmental impacts extend well beyond physical boundaries. Humans actually require wide swaths of the planet to obtain resources and discharge pollutants. Imagine the physical footprint of a stadium, and then extend that to game day. Think of all the people coming to the stadium, the cars they drive, the fuel being burned. Think of the lights at the stadium, lighting the field and the scoreboard. These are the sorts of impacts that get measured in a carbon footprint. When it comes to deciding what to include and exclude in carbon footprints for businesses, there are 2 major types of footprints. There are organizational footprints and product footprints, and there are different protocols that apply to each. Even under these protocols, the activities measured in an organizational footprint may vary, but typically include things like on-site fuel use and purchased electricity. When it comes to product carbon footprints, the activities measured may be much more extensive and typically extend all the way back to the beginning of the supply chain. Consumer products companies have even started labeling things like beer and potato chips. Even something we all use every day, like paper, plays a complex role in the carbon cycle. Paper production begins with harvesting a forest to make fiber to produce the paper. A forest today has been storing carbon for decades. The carbon is stored in the wood, the leaves, and even the soil. Interrupting the storage cycle by harvesting the trees immediately releases some of this stored carbon. Later, some of the wood may be burned to assist in the paper-making process, releasing more of the stored carbon into the atmosphere. Some of this stored carbon remains in the paper itself. This carbon will be released when the paper is disposed, either as carbon dioxide during incineration or as methane in the landfill. There's bound to be some confusion around the idea of a carbon footprint. As you can see, there are many variables to be considered. In this series, it's my purpose to act as your guide in such an unfamiliar terrain, to make the complicated ideas simple. I'm Dr. Bob Voss, and this is the Carbon Series. Be some confusion.
Okay. That's a general video of just in summary form. Seem to get full screen.
The one on the right hand side before the minus sign. Keep going to right. No, up. You see where the plus and the minus is? Just press F5. Or F5, yeah.
F5.
F5.
F5. Okay, just press F5. Okay, thanks a lot. That'll be good. Right. Right. Like all presentations, part of the PGCHE view of teaching is that we've got some learning outcomes. And today's session, within the hour, I envisage that you get an understanding of the carbon quantification mechanics. That means, how do we actually account for carbon within an organization or within ourselves? And at the same time developing a carbon footprint model for management compliances and for reporting your carbon for the purposes of corporate reporting and stakeholder requirements. So at the end of this session, you should have the ability to understand the chronological perspective of carbon emissions, understand the categorization of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which I'll come to in a moment, formulate a quantification model. We'll do 2 or 3 examples on how we actually do that. And we have the final position is the management decision-making process of a particular company's carbon reporting at the end of the day. The first, just to give you a background, the carbon footprint has been evolving for the past, 40 years. And the first declaration was in 1972 called the Stockholm Declaration, which made the first reference where scientists began to feel that the Earth was beginning to warm up. And they felt that, there's a scientific debate about climate change. So but the Stockholm Declaration decided to put the motion in place and to make carbon emissions and sustainability on their agenda. And the agenda was that all UN nations who attended the Stockholm Declaration made a commitment and a common strategy to challenging the emissions that we were, carbon emissions that globally were affecting a lot of different climate changes that had happened over the past 2 to 3 years prior to that. So the declaration is something that was built up by the United Nations, and as you all know and heard most famously was the Kyoto Protocol, which we'll come to that in a minute, which actually brought together the UN mandate for which there was a strict declaration of carbon emissions. But prior to that, just going back on the chronological, historical perspective, the Brundtland Report, our common feature, has anybody heard about it, read it in the past? The Brundtland Report was, in fact, the watershed for sustainability, and it was in 1987. Our common future, which the title strictly says, that it began to place a serious emphasis on global warming, climate change, and sustainability and sustainable development. So these were all early presets to larger ones, which in 2014 we got things like slavery, money laundering, protection of workers' rights, women's rights. They've all come back from 1987. And the UK, as you all know, has been in the forefront of for expanding the Brundtland Report, and in 1990 it began to introduce air pollution controls in the UK. One of the famous reasons why the UK took the front was that in prior years, our industries in the north of England and some parts in the south were spewing enormous amounts of carbon dioxide emissions, soot, and whatever, for which we had the famous fog, if you remember. Britain in the morning was a foggy nation, and people felt that was one of the reasons was the pollution, air pollution, which is there. We still haven't got rid of it still. In 1992, which is another famous historical perspective for carbon emissions, was the Rio conference, and they got something called the Agenda 42, Agenda 21, stated that member nations must have environmentally sound management principles and target for the prevention of hazardous emissions and effluents. So now we have reached 1992. The world has global warming has still been an issue, and carbon emissions were ferociously fought by lobby groups which felt that, you know, a steel mill in Scunthorpe with old technology could spew as much gases as it liked. But things had begun to change. So in 1994, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was established, for which it was the beginning of what we call a carbon quota. So each country in the UK, in Europe, elsewhere, could not agree on the amount of gases that we could emit. And as you know, the biggest proponent of being not compliant with any of this was the USA. The USA was not interested in any of these greenhouse gases. So when we come back to the Kyoto Protocol began to set up international binding emission targets. So how do we actually do these emission targets? The emission targets was, again, you couldn't tell a country, can you just spew out 2 million tons of carbon, and Germany spews out 10 million tons of carbon. So there was disagreement in how much a particular nation could emit. And at the same time, there were development countries like China at that time, not anymore, and India and some countries where felt that they didn't want any restrictions, but they wanted to continue emitting pollution as much as possible. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change began to stick numbers, but the numbers were rejected. As the UK was in the forefront of climate change, it was affecting the UK more than any other country at that particular time. The Kyoto Protocol was creeping into legislation. So the first legislation that the UK decided to do in 2008 was the Climate Change Act. The Climate Change Act was in some way a very, very robust act. It was a stick to organizations, and the organizations had to comply with a mandatory emissions of 30% of their emissions by 2020 based on the base year of 1990. This particular one which I put there was to do with 60% by 2050. So, what do you think the emissions of NTU is? Pretty large?
Quite low.
In comparison, quite low. It's not exactly low compared to the size of the university, because NTU has got a lot of emissions, but newer modern buildings, NTU has become to build the newer modern buildings which take care of a lot of their carbon. So if you build a building today, like this, I remember seeing this building just completing. Before it can be passed, it needs to go through a carbon audit before the building can actually be passed under the planning stage. So all buildings as of recently have to go through a rigorous process of how much carbon they're going to emit. So NTU, in fact, has got. Well, I did it as a test for NTU estates. They ran into a couple of thousand tons of carbon emissions. One of the biggest problems we face in quantifying carbon is that they are so wide. So have you ever thought that your Apple computer, to buy it in the UK, there is something we call transportation carbon for it to be manufactured. So in NTU, they got numerous amounts of purchases and every purchase has got a carbon intensity factor. This intensity factor I'll come to later on, which is how the United Kingdom government has set particular numbers. Okay, so we know what we are talking about carbon. The next thing is that, how do we account for this? Tomorrow you are managers of a company and you are involved in ensuring that the company accounts for its carbon, manages its carbon, complies with the target of the carbon, and at the same time reports its carbon. So you need the tools. The first tool that you need to have is you need to have an environmental management system. Now, like all management systems, there are essential infrastructure procedures. How does NTU as a university, which we are closest here, actually account for its carbon? And what sort of accountability processes are involved within the management of NTU that actually goes around with a little laptop and actually calculates the amount of emissions that involved. It's a very, very complex process, and complex in the process that has actually made a lot of companies not bother, because it's too involved, it needs a lot of expertise, and they were not interested in an environmental management system. But there was a stick behind it. The stick behind it was actually with the Climate Change Act, where every boardroom there are shareholders, and shareholders are interested to ensure that you're not the polluter and polluting the atmosphere, and they want good governance. They want the company for which they earn the dividends has actually got good governance. So the environmental management system was a key essential for ensuring that there was regulation and good governance. In order to establish an environmental management system, we need a standard. You just can't pick one up. And for that, there was the ISO International Standards Organization 1400 series. Set of guidelines. HEI is actually higher education institute, an establishment to strengthen environmental policies, environmental aspects of its operation, define environmental objectives, set targets, correct action. It's very much of management. It is that thick. So companies have begun to put in some level of environmental management systems. Did you know that if you went to Marks & Spencer today and you wanted to offer them a particular product, the first thing that the Marks & Spencer procurement manager would ask you, what's your carbon? What's your carbon footprint per unit? And he says, I don't know. That means the door is not open. So, and he says to you that, oh, I buy my product from China and I don't know what's going on there. So, it was a very easy route that previously companies used to have. But now, Marks & Spencer, or virtually almost all PLCs, will have to record for their supplier chain carbon emissions. So you need to audit your suppliers too, whether they conform towards the regulations. So if you want to buy something from China, and he tells you, oh, it's 1 million tons, and you say yes, but you have to get it verified. Anything that comes out to make from many supplier companies need to be verified with carbon emissions. Now, how do we do a verification of a carbon footprint of an organization? Of course. There is actually a company called Bureau Veritas, or one of them. or now we're going to get KPMG and all that working together. So what they do is that they need to make a factory audit and then give you a particular carbon value for which you might think that it's good. But what is the other problem that you're faced with? The problems you're faced with is that in the UK, you are bound by the Climate Change Act, for which you have a 30% emissions target based on a 1990 base value. You think it's tough to reach a 1990 base value? Say we decided in 2010 that we're going to benchmark our carbon emissions, and in 1990 our emissions were 80,000 tons, and today we are 280,000 tons. Now how are we going to achieve it? We don't care. So, boardrooms are faced with multiple problems. If you didn't comply, what's the penalty? There was an act of parliament, and a company has decided didn't comply.
Jail.
No, we don't jail the board. We could. They fine you. So the Department of Environment will then come over and fine you. At the present, in the market rate is about 20 euros a ton. Have you all heard of emissions trading, carbon trading?
Yeah.
Well, carbon trading has got a bad name because it was the same people who actually sold us the subprime mortgages. They sold us all these phony junk bonds, and it was the bankers who went behind carbon trading. And so when the carbon trading came into place, everyone said, we're not interested because it's all illusion. You can't quantify a carbon because it's an unquantifiable value. So who steps in? As of the beginning of October 2014, the European Union has stepped in. The European Union has, in fact, set up a quota for, you believe it or not, the steel companies. Steel companies are notoriously polluted. So they set a target for steel companies, and the same way, they used the 1990 as a base year and began to fine steel companies. Why should you fine the steel companies? Because they were using old technology, they were not in fact improving their technology, and they were just spewing out horrible carbon. So, what is the latest company that actually went bust in the UK? Steel company. Well, not bust, but had to shut down. Most of the steel works in Wales, in South Wales, went down. Most of the steel mills in Scunthorpe, Newcastle, these places, they began to close down because steel was no longer a profitable way of, the methodology used was 50 years old and it was not efficient enough for carbon. So that's the background. The next thing is that we have got the greenhouse effect, for which we have got now, we're going to come into the measurement. We got, anybody heard of the greenhouse protocol? It's a very, very popular government body for which it has joined hands with the World Resources Institute and World Business Council for Sustainable Development and recommended technical recommendations for quantifying emissions from various shareholders, businesses, and non-governmental agencies. So, As I come back again, the UK Climate Change Act 2008, you can see on the, has made the target of 2050 of 50% by 2050 and at least 30% on 2020. Now this is enormously difficult, but it's a legislation that we need to do. The next stick which the government introduced was the UK's Companies Act 2006, amended in October 2013. The Companies Act 2006 made it mandatory for directors' report to report their carbon emissions and their company's effect on climate change. Any reason why? Why should you worry about climate change?
Because it may impact.
Well, most companies, like Tate and Lye, it buys a lot of sugar from its former colonies. Now, global warming can increase commodity costs, and commodity costs can then increase, and then the buying cost of their input in their factory processes would increase, and of course, at the end of the day, it's you and me who pay for the price. So if you went out and bought a cup of coffee from Starbucks, it's at £3. If there was Starbucks who say that in their accounts that climate change is affecting them, coffee beans are getting smaller and not as delicious as they used to be, coffee is now £5. So there is a knock-on effect on this. So directors must disclose their carbon as much as possible, but they have got certain guidelines. We won't go into that. I've been talking about carbon emissions. They are divided into three groups. So the first one is that greenhouse emissions which are directly controlled by the company, means like your own electricity meter. The second part is that, to put it in simple way, is that you're not controlled by yourself. It's supplied from other people. So it's called purchased electricity, will be one of them. And the last one is scope 3, is purely to do with business travel, supply chain, the landfill, waste disposal, those kind of scopes, which are emissions which are involved in getting there. So when you actually chuck your rubbish here, you've got 3 canisters here of different rubbish. They are taken to a central position and weighed. They are then weighed to say how much of that amount actually can be recycled, or waste, or landfill. And then it's entered into their carbon footprint. So it's not necessarily you have 3 because it goes somewhere. So actually, this goes out and weighed. Now, scope 1 and 2 and 3 are the major carbon categorizations, for which we're going to now try to find a way of identifying the various emissions as classified. In a particular day, in the world, actually, we got vapor, we got carbon dioxide, we got condensation. It's a huge array of emissions, for which is very difficult to identify. Now, the biggest thing is that identifying and categorizing emissions are beginning to be formulated as models. So, as I said, scope 1 is direct emissions, scope 2 indirect emissions, scope 3 is indirect emissions. Now, how do we calculate this? Identify, measure, and account. Do we worry as ordinary citizens? We don't really worry, but we do worry in a sense that we have got an appreciation, and we like to contribute to our general thinking that someone is measuring and identifying. So, what do you call it? What is an emission factor? Yeah. So How did you travel this morning? Oh, that's not good. Anybody travel by car or tram?
Yep.
Okay, so we traveled by tram today. We had a 5 miles, but unfortunately these are all in kilometers because we have become metric. Say it was a 5-kilometer travel, a round trip, using a tram has got an intensity factor. So if you want to know how much carbon was actually incurred by yourself on the 5-mile trip, is that you looked at the intensity factor and you multiplied by 5. Now where do you get these intensity factors? Who do you think has got the biggest power in able to give us the intensity factor? In the UK, who's taken a lead in intensity factors is an quango called DEFRA. D-E-F-R-A? Okay. Not to worry. Yeah. So, we want to know how much of electricity is consumed this afternoon for 1 hour. Any clue? Say it was about 5 kilowatt hour we burnt to do this particular lesson. So we then go to the DEFRA website. We pick up from there an intensity factor, and then we multiply it. So if you wanted to do as an example, you went home to your electricity meter. Whenever you think about it, you measure it. If it's not digital, you say you consume about 200 kilowatts of electricity during the quarter. You can multiply that with the intensity factor, and that will give you the carbon emissions in there. Now, I'm going to give you an example of the emission factor which I picked up from DEFRA's website. DEFRA has actually categorized this into small, medium, and large cars. And you can see in there's the diesel and petrol. And under that, for every kilometer of a small car travel, use kilometers for our purposes, the emission is 0.15859. That is the amount of emissions of carbon you would emit for every kilometer of traveling. Do you think that's substantial? Not knowing how much it is? Actually, if you want to know how much one point, if you use your hands and cover it with just soot, just normal soot, that is your 1 mile. So there's quite a lot of carbon being emitted. So the answer here is that you can pick your car, whoever's got a car, whether it's small, medium, large, diesel or petrol, pick a value, put it in your notepad and see how you calculate this out. So the motor vehicle emissions factor was asked me, how did they get them? These are actually emissions which are very, very complex to explain, but they come from, when you go for an MOT at your garage, they stick an emissions probe in the exhaust, and he says, whoa, I'm giving you so much. And then they use the CC of the car, and then they work out some matrices and come up with that value. Electricity data. Where do you think the UK is getting its electricity from? Good. From what source? Coal. Actually, Britain gets more than 2/3 of its electricity from nuclear power. And where do you think that's coming from? France. Yeah. So when you're consuming all this electricity, it's actually. Do you think that nuclear power factor is low or high in emissions? Low. Correct. So Britain, in order to keep up to its commitment to the Kyoto Protocol, it is buying more electricity in nuclear power and less on coal. So how many coal stations in the UK left?
5. 60.
Less than 5.
Oh,
3.
So because it's no more economical to have to have nuclear power, but we have one very close by in Nottingham. That's one of them, but that is will be decommissioned in a couple of years. So electricity is the largest amount of data. So from here you can see your electricity activity data is from the amount of kilowatts. The year is 2015, which is the current one. So one kilowatt unit gives you kg CO2e. What's E mean? What we call carbon equivalent. Carbon equivalent means that it's very hard to, it's not only carbon itself that's being emitted. The other gases are like methane, nitrous oxide, and they are very, very difficult to calculate. So they use something called a figure called equivalent, and you can see the nitrous oxide is 0.0334. It's very small. As an example, a typical house in the UK uses annually 5,500 kilowatts per year, times it by the intensity factor, 0.462, and got a little calculation of what it is, which I told you that. The other car, for the motor car, which I told you, if you have a small car, 1,000 miles is equal to 1,609 kilometers, multiplied by the intensity factor, 0.1589, you get 225. So these factors, I'm just showing you the mechanics because to give you an appreciation how carbon footprints are calculated. Now, airline travel. If you had to travel from here to Australia and you find that there are about 200 planes flying in the same direction, you can imagine how much of carbon dioxide is actually emitted in the upper stratosphere. So, again, there is the domestic, short haul, long haul. You can see from the diagram, if you travel business class, you pay a higher carbon factor. If you travel economy class, a bit less. So don't ask me how this is worked out, but I think they work out the whole aircraft as a whole and then divide it per passenger in different classes. Premium economy. So, at the end of the day, we have a categorization of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and we come up with a value X, Y, and Z, and then we have a total carbon footprint. Now, although I made it very simplistically, scope 1 and scope 2 is quite easy. Scope 3 is different. Because, did you ever do a travel survey last year? With NTU? No? Yeah. Well, if you did, I would have picked it up. Because my dissertation was to do with scope 3, travel. So I picked up all the travel data that everyone got, and it was calculated in that way. So what are the scope 3s we have? Supply chain. Do you think a company like Dell, who doesn't make anything, it buys in all its products, would it want to account for its scope 3 in a big way? Actually, Dell is beginning to do it because Dell computers are very corporate orientated. So you'll find that somebody in the corporate procurement will say, "What's your carbon footprint?" You will ask that question, and you must be able to answer that. So finally, you get a carbon footprint. Now, summarizing going forward, how do we report them? So I've taken this particular one which I used before, that a company must show its shareholders the different types of emissions that is actually incurred, meaning that it has to benchmark its own emissions, and then boardroom has to decide whether it complies with the Climate Change Act 2008, which says that you need to meet your emissions at 30% by 2020. Do you think that's achievable?
Yes.
Actually, quite funny, you're right. A lot of companies actually have been able to achieve that. Does it make sense for a company to actually be of a lower carbon footprint? Would you read this particular report and say, well, I think this company is good. You'll be interested in doing it, in buying their products? Would you? Do you have an ethical purchase mind? Would an Apple buyer like yourself have an ethical purchase mind? Is that? No, you buy it for its functionality. Right? You're not the only one. Everybody says the same thing. But what has happened is that as a shareholder, they began to put pressure on Apple to make sure that it does measure its reporting ground. Because shareholders and stakeholders, whoever they may be, have got access to this information of carbon being emitted by a particular company, would that serve any particular purpose to the profitability of a company? Does lower cost equal to lower prices?
Not necessarily. No.
Well, the jury's out, but there is possibility, but depends on the particular product that you do. Lower carbon means lower prices. That's the objective. But whether you achieve it or not, you don't really know. So if you put the building blocks together, if a particular product is being sourced from somewhere which is efficiently produced, you actually got lower carbon and lower prices. So if your supply chain right across the supply chain gives you lower cost, lower cost, lower cost, lower cost, I think you can achieve a lower cost. Would you think that having a reporting format makes sense for anyone? Like here, they have a base here in this particular company. If you look through the information, it's very well written. That's why it's particularly chosen that they got 2008 and 2009. In 2009, it emitted 9,227, which you can see on the left. And in 2009, this side, sorry, that was 2008. 2009 was 8,970. So this company is particularly making strides in improving its carbon emissions. Apart from carbon emissions, do you think we're interested in water? Do you worry that your flush in your home is a single flush or a double flush, or you run the tap? would somebody who, I'm sure there's a lot of beer drinkers, they would say that to brew a pint of beer, you need 5 pints of water. So, water is becoming a scarce commodity, and certain companies are forced to account for their water. There are lots of information that goes by with whether to report a particular item. But we are dealing with what government legislation has come about. Do you think the Climate Change Act make any sense to anyone? Or do we need a Climate Change Act? Do we need that?
Yeah.
How would you benefit? Do we need something like so strong as a stick? You know, I mean, legislatively, I mean, we won't do anything. Yeah, that's true. Do you know that the climate change, the UK is the first country, I mean, way back, to actually implement targets. It's only Europe has just happened to it. It took them so long. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, they are also in the forefront, very much so. But gradually, more and more companies in Europe are there. Now, in Europe, they're talking about carbon targets. So each country will have a target. Yeah.
Can you just explain what carbon is? What is carbon?
Carbon.
Yeah, I don't actually really know what it is. I've heard of it.
Carbon is
Like,
well,
it's,
if you went to the back of a bus,
yeah.
you know, you see that combustion, that heavy soot that's emitted. That soot then goes up into the air, and of course, gradually, there's a layer of heavy gases, which then prevent the ultraviolet light from the sun reaching the earth, because it's reflected back into space, and from there, there's climate warming. You know, the earth heats up, the oceans warm up.
Do you have to burn fuel or just burn in anything?
You can burn anything as carbon. It would be from anything that's got a carbon value in it in the product. Carbon means C2, CH2, anything that's got a C in chemistry, if you remember. Anything that is burning or converted from one state to another state usually involves a carbon. And carbon is usually a very, very heavy chemical that stays too long in the air.
So why is it so bad for the atmosphere then?
It's because it reaches when it reaches the upper atmosphere, when it's not absorbed, it lingers in the stratosphere, just below the stratosphere, for which the ultraviolet light from space or from the sun doesn't reach the earth.
Don't they argue that we've already surpassed the tipping point, and any form of carbon reduction now still isn't going to make a necessary impact? It's just going to mitigate it. It's still going to occur. You're still going to see natural sea level rises, mass flooding, all the impacts affecting crops, vegetation, and stuff like that. It's just a simple process. So it's more the fact that if you can get your economies such as India and China, that are going to be your emerging economies that really push and promote almost CO2, it's just a case of getting them on board to almost commit to these changes.
That has been the central debate that actually has been going on for a long, long time, because there's an anti-camp that said, you know, this is just an evolutionary process we're not really worried about. But I think what we should do is that we should make our own evaluation. Do you think the UK weather has changed?
It's more indecisive.
Yeah, of course, because science is, yeah, because science, science is difficult to follow. Do you know that in 2 weeks' time you're going to get the hottest day in Britain? Has anybody heard the news?
What day is that?
It's always a hot day, isn't it?
At end of July. So we won't. I mean, you don't want to complain that you're not in Greece, but the question is that, as far as I remember, climates of intense heat has not happened in the UK. Has it got very cold? Have you seen snow? It's not very cold, yeah? Generally, I mean, last winter was it cold? I guess so in Nottingham. But it's not as severe as in the past. So there is a change, a small change, but for winter. But isn't the anti-camp should understand that anything you burn, you know, you've got two factors. You're going to reduce the number of oil wells that they're going to dig tomorrow to fuel our cars, which is the greatest emitter. and the other one is reduce electricity. There are a lot of oil-fired electricity generation all over the world. Apart from coal, it's oil generated. So we are digging the ground infinitely, and we are burning. So if we slow it down, maybe we'll have a longer time for the earth to recover, as they say. Like everything else, we just need a little breathing space for it to recover, and maybe things will change. I mean, we talk about polar ice cap melting and things like that. So, any other typical questions?
Yeah. You know, did you say that the UK is the only country to have targets? Is that what you said?
No, it was the only country to begin, the first country to institute a target.
And when did we do that?
2008.
And who does everyone in the EU have done that?
EU is only happened in 2014.
So, yeah.
So, although the Britain took a lead in 2008, because there was confusion as who to emit more and less. So they decided that, okay, each individual company, PLCs, and of course NTU, has to emit its carbon footprint to be 30% by 2020.
But if only a certain percentage of us in the world do it, how much of a benefit is that going to be when the EU, in relation to it, is quite small?
Yeah, that's very difficult to get agreement worldwide. It's one of our biggest problems with the
But why
UN.
wouldn't they agree if it's something that's so important?
Why don't they agree is there is a little carrot, is aid. A lot of the third world countries, as you say, they don't want to agree. The first world countries are beginning to set targets, and the third world countries, they don't want to agree, but aid is cut down. And if you produce anything in the third world that is consumed in the first world, is subject to scrutiny. What is the biggest product that's actually very popular now? Like in Indonesia, palm oil has become a problem because of scrupulous multinationals cutting down the forest and growing palm oil. So the world has decided to say we're not buying any palm oil unless it comes from a sustainable region. And almost 60% of palm oil is not grown from sustainable areas. What about cocoa, your favorite chocolate? Do you think that has been also put in the bag? So there are incentives, and some countries, yes, they have that, but some countries they don't. But it's a matter of finding a balance that makes sense to both to the consumer and to the producer at the end of the day. So what would you do tomorrow when you want to know what your carbon footprint would be? Do you worry? Do you like to have an app? Not really. We don't want to bother, isn't it? So we like to push our responsibility to others. So when you pick up a packet of crisps, do you want to know what carbon is on that crisp?
Yeah.
So if we have Walker's crisp at 14 kilograms for that little packet, and we got, I don't know whether Smith's are still around, don't eat crisp. Smith's crisp, that was 18 kilograms. Will you make a conscious decision? Or will you be persuaded by price? Yeah. So do you think that consumers are interested in putting their carbon value in their products? Would it ever happen? No. Absolutely not. So the trick is that's why the Climate Change Act makes sure that we cannot bully them, but we can legislate for 30% of your of your emissions based on 1990 to be emitted at 2020. Isn't that a good way to make sure that you're actually complying to a lower carbon society? I think you should feel that it's a positive step in the right direction to ensure that companies are not excessively having poor governance of their carbon emissions. Okay, good. Any final questions, or the day is ended? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.